So we want to talk about Chapter 23. Chapter 23 is about international corporate finance. International finance, in some sense, is not very different from what we have studied thus far, which is domestic finance, finance applied to domestic financial markets or domestic capital markets. The main difference that makes international finance interesting or more challenging is the presence of the exchange rates. Because when you are talking about domestic finance, you're always discussing all your valuation in terms of your home currency, which is the US dollar for our case. But whenever we are talking about international finance, then we have to think about the payments or cash flows that you will either pay or receive as a result of transactions that cross the border. So we then have to account for exchange rates. Once we get into the realm of exchange rates, because exchange rates or currencies trade on an open market, open free market for the most part, then we have to also account for fluctuations in those currencies, that those currencies are going to go up or down in number. And because of that, it introduces an additional element of risk whenever we are talking about international transactions. So we have to account for how to measure that risk and how to properly mitigate that risk. And then there are a couple of interesting quirks about international finance that take into account issues like international taxation, the presence of political risk, international political risk that may arise due to wars, conflicts, trade treaties, and so on and so forth, maritime treaties and things like that. All of those play a role in the complexity of international finance. And a little bit about capital budgeting. Again, that relates to exchange rate risk. Anytime you are now capital budgeting for a foreign capital source, let's say you are trying to open up a factory in France and you are dealing with euros now. When those cash flows in euros have to be repatriated back to US dollar, that introduces an element of exchange rate risk. So we have to account for that. So when we think about international finance, the main source of challenge that arises comes from the presence of foreign exchange rates. So what is a foreign exchange rate? A foreign exchange rate is the price for a currency which is denominated in another currency. So when we think about any goods, for example, let's say we are thinking about a soda can. And the price of a soda can, we write it, let's say it's $1 per can. So what do we have? When we say this is the price of a soda can, we are saying that the numerical value of that is 1. It is denominated in US dollar, and then we are saying that this is the good that has been priced. So here is the good that has been priced. Here is its value. And this one is the currency. Exchange rate is no different. For an exchange rate, let's say we are trying to price or value euros. And we say that the value of euro is $1.50. So we have the same scheme. This is the good or the commodity that we are valuing. This is the value of euro, and this is the currency in which euro has been valued. So we are in this scheme, in this scheme over here, the value of a euro is being stated in US dollar, just as the value of a can of good or a can of a soda can was being stated in US dollar. So when we think about exchange rate in this manner, and this is essentially the exchange rate for dollars per euro. Or we can say that the value of €1, this is the value of the good that we are value of 1 euro is $1.50. That's foreign exchange rate. That's how we designate foreign exchange rates. Foreign exchange rates, then the next question comes is, where is this foreign exchange rate determined? Who determined this value of 150? And that is being determined in what we call the forex market, or simply the foreign exchange market. Like the stock market or like any commodity market, it is a market where currencies are traded. And unlike the New York Stock Exchange, it does not have a central physical location, but the currencies are traded globally through a network of computers. And what we think about mainly as a foreign exchange market is essentially a network of banks and brokers that are plugged into a secured financial network over which they transact their currencies. So they submit a bid, receive a bid, and then they have some procedures that requires them to either accept the bid or not accept the bid over a timed period. And then once both parties, one party has quoted the rate and the other party has accepted that rate, then at that moment, the value or the price at which they have agreed upon becomes the prevailing market price for that currency, just as it would be in the case of any ordinary good. So one of the interesting things that The Economist magazine does is they look at the price of a commodity. In this case, the commodity that they're tracking is the Big Mac, and they are tracking the price of that commodity across the world. For example, they are looking at the price of Big Mac in the US. The average price of a Big Mac is $4.37. But in India, it is 89 rupees. So of course, we cannot directly compare this with this. So what we have to do is convert the rupees into US dollars. And when we apply the appropriate exchange rate to convert the rupees into US dollar, we find that the equivalent cost of a Big Mac in India is $1.67. Conversely, the equivalent cost of a Big Mac in Sweden would be $7.62. It's the same Big Mac. Big Mac, wherever they're made, they're pretty much produced the same way, same similar ingredients. So there is a wide variation of the price of Big Mac stated in dollar terms across a wide range of countries. So in this case, then, what can we do? If we saw a pricing for a commodity, and assuming this is a commodity, meaning it's pretty standard, right? It's a pretty standard good. If we observe something like this, how can we take advantage of it? One way to take advantage of it would be, we go to India, we buy a Big Mac, we pay in rupees, okay? Then we take that Big Mac to Venezuela and we sell the Big Mac. Why do we go to Venezuela? Why do we buy it in India? Because that's the cheapest price. Why do we sell it in Venezuela? Because that's the highest price. So we buy, then we sell the Big Mac in Venezuela, and we receive, of course, bolivares. Once we receive the bolivares, then we take those bolivares and we exchange those bolivares for we exchange the bolivares for dollars. And once we receive the dollar, we exchange the dollar for rupees, and we are back to where we started from. And if in this transaction we end up with either more or less than what we started with, then we say that there is the presence of what we call arbitrage profits. There is a technical definition of arbitrage, which I will not get too much into details about it, but what it essentially signals is that I have bought, sold, exchanged it back, and I have ended up with either more of the rupees that I started with or less. In either case, there would be arbitrage. In this case, we will end up with more because we are buying it in a low price location. We are buying Big Mac in a low price location and selling it in a higher price location. So we will end up with more. And this more that we get, more than we started with, can be viewed off as arbitrage profit because we are making that profit without risking too much capital, without risking any capital, for example. A lot, because technically I can borrow these rupees and buy the Big Mac. So this kind of a arbitrage profit, which can be equivalent to saying that this is like free money, this kind of arbitrage profit or free money cannot exist in a free functioning market, because if this were to exist, everybody would buy Big Macs in India and sell them in Venezuela. If they buy Big Macs in India, then the price of Big Mac is going to go up in India, and in Venezuela, the price of Big Mac will go down. Eventually, until equilibrium is restored, until there is equilibrium. So, in the long run, this kind of situation cannot happen. However, then the question becomes, why do these pricing discrepancy exist? Where there is such a wide discrepancy in pricing between India and Venezuela for the price of Big Mac. And the reason is, a commodity like Big Mac cannot really be arbitrage. We really cannot technically buy Big Macs in India and sell them in Venezuela. If we could, then we could have eliminated that pricing discrepancy. But for other commodities where it is possible to buy and sell freely across borders, then that kind of pricing discrepancy is probably not going to exist, or even if it existed, it would not persist. So when we think about the currency market, much of the global trade is still conducted in US dollar. And if you combine the dollar and the euro together, they account for more than half of the global trade that occurs today. Although there are over 150 currencies in the world, 2 currencies account for more than half of the global trade. So what do you mean by that? So if a US manufacturer is buying goods from abroad or selling goods abroad, in either case, they may demand that their transaction be done in US dollar. So that's easy to understand why US dollar would be part of that trade. But that alone does not account for half of the global trade, nearly half, about 40% of the global trade being conducted in US dollar. That number used to be much higher, let's say 20 or 30 years ago, close to 60, 70%. Now it's close to about 40%. Still a very dominant global currency. What also is part of the global trade in US dollar is when, let's say, a country like Egypt imports some goods from India. Now, the Indian exporter can demand that the Egyptian importer pay in rupees, but it is more likely that the Indian importer will demand payment in dollar. So that signifies that the US dollar is a preeminent currency of trade, and one of the factors that is behind the US dollar being a global preeminent currency for trade is that it is related to the stability of both the US political system as well as the stability of the US markets. And stability is related to transparency, proper regulation, and an organized way in which the markets work. So that has contributed to the sustaining leadership of the US dollar. Part of the leadership of the US dollar came post-World War II, when the US was not only on the winning side of the World War, but also one of the largest power that had most of its infrastructure intact compared to the infrastructure of large powers in Europe, i.e. France, England, or Germany. So that kind of gave US the boost it needed to establish dollar as a global trade currency, and then it kept that edge partly because of its economic stability and political stability. among many other things. So the next thing we want to look at is exchange rates. How are these exchange rates determined? So exchange rates are determined essentially through the buying and selling of currency in a organized market. So the question, why is the Argentine peso 5.5897 pesos per dollar? So this is pesos is the currency, 5.59 is the value, and this is per US dollar. So why is this the value? Why is it not 6 or why is it not 5? Why is it 5.59? It is 5.59 based on the simple fact of supply and demand. So the supply curve and the demand curve, so we're looking at quantity of currency and we're looking at the price of currency, and we see that they intersect over here. So this is the equilibrium amount of currency being traded, and this is pesos per dollar. This is 5.59 pesos per dollar. So that's how the value of a currency is determined. Of course, the underlying question is what determines the supply of a currency and the demand for a currency. Supply and demand for a currency are determined by essentially trade. Mostly it is determined by trade. When goods cross border, that transaction has to be settled in a foreign currency. For example, a US importer buys certain goods from China. The Chinese renminbi is used to, let's say, for the US importer to pay the Chinese company, there are two options. The US importer can pay the Chinese company in US dollar. But for the Chinese company, the US dollar is not their currency of trade. So they have to then take the US dollar to the foreign exchange market and convert it to the Chinese currency, renminbi. And when they convert it to the Chinese currency, that's what contributes to the supply of the US currency. Similarly, there would be demand for the US currency. For example, if the US company requires that the Chinese company accept payment in US dollar, then the Chinese company would sell their renminbi and buy US dollars from the open market. That would contribute to the demand for US dollar. And this process of supply and demand establishes the equilibrium value of the currency, and in this case it happens to be 5.59 approximately. Now when we look at currencies, we can not only put them in pesos per dollar, but also we can put them in what we call US dollar equivalent, which is dollars per peso. So in this case, in the first case, we're looking at the value of the US dollar in terms of a foreign currency, which happens to be the Argentine peso over here. In this second case, what we are doing, we are looking at the value of the Argentine foreign currency in terms of the US dollar. So the question is, what is going to be this missing number? And this missing number is simply going to be a reciprocal, because one is reciprocal of the other. So 1 divided by 5.5897 will give us 0.1789. So that value is 0.1789 dollars per peso. So the equivalence is that dollars per peso is equal to 1 over pesos per dollar. Another way I can write this is, say, home currency divided by foreign currency is equal to 1 over foreign currency divided by home currency. That's kind of the generic rule that you can apply to any situation. So they are essentially the price of the US dollar and the price of the peso are essentially reciprocals of each other. The US equivalent and the US dollar quote are essentially equivalents of each other. So exchange rates are quoted every day in the newspaper. For example, over here we see the quote for the US. This is US equivalent. This column over here is always foreign currency per, no, sorry, that column there. This column over here is dollar per foreign currency. And this column over here is foreign currency per US dollar. And as you can see, they are essentially reciprocals of each other. The exchange rates, because they are determined by this supply and demand for currencies, the exchange rates then obviously fluctuate every day, because every day there are things that impact the supply or demand of the currency. What are those things that impact the supply and demand of currency? Things like trade of goods, buying and selling of stocks and bonds, and then finally the action of central banks like the Federal Reserve. So three main things: buying and selling of goods, services, investments, and the activities of the central bank. Those three things together lead to supply and demand for the currency. And as supply and demand changes, for example, something may cause the demand of the currency to increase, so demand curve would shift out, and an exchange rate would then increase from the previous value to its new value. So that signifies an increase in the exchange rate. Similarly, something may cause the supply curve to fall, and exchange rate may decrease in this case. So buying and selling of goods causes exchange rates to either go up or go down. So whenever exporters and importers are engaged in foreign trade, they have to deal with the risk that is inherent in the trade. And the risk that is inherent in the trade is not just the normal risk of buying and selling goods, but in this case, the risk that arises due to the rise and fall of currencies. Because of this additional supply and demand factor that they have to account for, they have to now not only contend with the normal cycle of business risk, they also have to contend with additional currency risk. So we'll talk a little bit about that. And so this picture over here gives us the exchange rate for the US dollar, what is the global price of US dollar in terms of euro. So this is giving us the value dollars per euro. So in some sense, what is happening over here, initially what we see that dollars per euro is increasing, and then dollars per euro is decreasing. So when dollars per euro, since the exchange rate is given in dollars per euro, this increase implies that the value of euro is going up. So think about this. Over here, the value of euro is about, let's say, 0.95. So this is $0.95 per euro. At its peak over here, it is somewhere about $1.35 per euro. Okay? So what does it mean? I could buy or sell 1 euro at 0.95 in 2001, but around 2005, I'm buying and selling that same euro for 135. So obviously, the value of euro has gone up. Similarly, when we are looking at this down cycle, then we would conclude that the value of euro is going down. And the reason we conclude that because we have quoted the exchange rate in this manner. So what we are essentially looking at, this one, the euro that is after the slash sign, is what we call our referent currency. The currency that we are referring to in terms of the exchange rate, because we're looking at dollars per euro. So that's the direct way we can measure the impact of euro, the change in valuation for euro. When the graph is going up, euro is going up. When graph is going down, euro is going down. But what is also true, when this is happening, what is also true, an increase in the value of euro implies that the value of dollar is going down. And a decrease in the value of euro also implies that the value of dollar is going up. Why? Because of the reciprocalness of the currency. We had already talked about this before, that dollars per euro is equal to 1 over euros per dollar. So if dollars per euro went up, then euros per dollar has to go down so that we can preserve this equality. Right? So for that equality to work, if the left-hand side goes up, the number on the right-hand side has to go down. This number over here has to go down. So although we can directly comment on the referent currency, in this case the referent currency is the euro, we can also indirectly understand what is happening to the US dollar in this case. So let's take a look at the impact of this fluctuation in currency that we are observing over here in the graph. So we look at this problem that the exchange rate is $1.30 per euro. So $1.30 per euro is 130. $1.30 per euro. Manzini ordered parts for next year's production. This is key. So standing here today on the timeline, he is ordering parts for next year. And they agree upon a price of 500,000 euros to be paid when the parts are delivered in 1 year. So they are entering into the transaction today, but the payment will be done a year from now. So 1 year later, of course, the exchange rate changes. In this case, exchange rate is now 145, which means the value of euro has gone up. So what was the actual cost in dollars for Manzini when the payment was due? And if the price had been set in the US currency, what would have been, how many euros would have been received by the importer? So the price was set at 500,000 euros, and the exchange rate at the time was $145 per euro. So we are multiplying $1.45 per euro. We are going to be multiplying this by 500,000 euros. So what happens? The math is essentially dollars per euro multiplied by euros. So the euro and euro cancel. We are left with US dollar. How much? 725,000. So had the payment been made in US dollar, which was 650,000, we would have saved about 75,000. So the net impact of the euro increasing in value from 130 to 145 was that we are essentially paying $75,000 more, or about 12% more than what we would have originally paid. Had the price been set at $650,000, then what would be the equivalent value in euros? So in this case, we have dollars and we have to convert them into euros. So I will divide this by dollars per euro. So what happens? Essentially, again, the dollar and dollar cancel, and I'm left with 1 over 1 divided by euro, which is equal to euro. So I take 650,000, divide that by 145, that gives me 448,276 euros. So in this case, the cost would be about 10%, or the Campano's payment would be, or payment received would be about 10% less than what they would have had it been set in euros. So one thing we can conclude, whether the price was set in euros or dollar, one party would have suffered a substantial loss, right? If the payment is set in euros, then Manzini suffers a 12% loss. If the payment is set in dollars, then Campagnolo suffers a 10% loss. And what is the source for that? The main source is the fluctuation in currency. So that's what we call exchange rate risk. So one of the ways in which they can mitigate that risk is to hedge. So we will learn next about how to hedge for foreign currency risk. We will learn that in the next lecture.